You ever notice how some people don't attack you directly, but they never miss an opportunity to joke about you either? On the surface, it sounds harmless. A laugh here, a smirk there, maybe even a group of people chuckling so it feels socially validated. But if you pay close attention, there's a difference between humor that connects people and humor that quietly positions someone below others. That's where the psychology becomes interesting, because real humor builds bridges. It creates shared relief, shared perspective, shared humanity. But when sarcasm is used as a repeated pattern toward one specific person, something shifts. It stops being about laughter and starts becoming about positioning. It becomes a socially acceptable way of delivering something that, if said directly, would be too confrontational or too revealing of intent. This is why people who harbor quiet resentment often gravitate toward jokes instead of honesty. Direct confrontation requires ownership. It requires clarity. It requires standing behind your words without protection. But humor gives cover. It allows someone to say something sharp and then retreat behind the phrase, "I was just joking." And in that retreat, accountability disappears. Psychologically, this is subtle dominance behavior. Not dominance in a dramatic or aggressive sense, but in a social sense. Because if a person can repeatedly make you the subject of jokes, especially in group settings, they are also shaping perception. They are training the room to associate you with a certain role, the clumsy one, the naive one, the overly serious one, the one who can't take a joke. And once that role is established, it starts to stick, even if it's not true. What makes it more complex is that it's often mixed with just enough friendliness to keep you uncertain. They might laugh with you in one moment, then target you in the next. That inconsistency creates internal confusion. You start questioning your own reaction. Am I being too insensitive? Was that actually offensive? Or am I overthinking it? And that uncertainty is exactly what allows the pattern to continue. Because here's the truth, intention doesn't always announce itself clearly, but patterns do. One joke is nothing. Even a few jokes might be nothing. But when the same person consistently uses humor at your expense, especially in ways that feel slightly edged or repetitive, it becomes less about humor and more about communication, just not the kind that is spoken openly. And there's another layer here that most people miss. In social dynamics, humor is often used to test boundaries. Someone might say something slightly disrespectful disguised as a joke just to observe your reaction. If you laugh along, they learn there's room to continue. If you push back confidently, they learn there are limits. So in that sense, these jokes are not just expressions of emotion, they are experiments in how far social pressure can be applied without consequence. But the real issue is not the joke itself. It's what happens when it becomes a pattern that consistently leaves you smaller in your own eyes. Because over time, even subtle repetition changes self-perception. You begin to internalize the role that's being assigned to you. You might become quieter in group settings. You might hesitate before speaking. Not because anything explicit has happened, but because your nervous system has learned that visibility comes with subtle cost. This is why awareness matters. Not paranoia, not overanalysis, but awareness. The ability to distinguish between shared laughter and targeted repetition, between genuine connection and subtle positioning. Because once you see the pattern clearly, it loses its invisible power over you. And when you respond differently, not emotionally, not defensively, but calmly and consciously, you change the entire dynamic. You stop participating in the role that was being assigned to you. You reclaim authorship over how you are perceived, not by controlling others, but by refusing to unconsciously accept their framing. At the deepest level, this isn't about jokes at all. It's about whether you allow subtle language to define your identity, or whether you stay rooted enough in yourself to recognize when humor stops being light and starts becoming a tool of quiet limitation. And once you see that line clearly, you can never unsee it again. There's a very specific kind of behavior that most people feel before they can fully explain it. You walk into a room and everything seems normal. They smile, they greet you, they act fine. But something about it doesn't match. The energy isn't consistent. It feels slightly rehearsed in public, but noticeably different when the audience disappears. And that difference between public warmth and private coldness is where the psychology becomes revealing, because genuine social connection is relatively stable. People don't need an audience to respect you if that respect is real. They don't need witnesses to be kind if kindness is their default. But when someone's behavior changes depending on who is watching, you are no longer dealing with pure emotion, you are dealing with image management. In public settings, they may appear friendly, even overly polite. They laugh at your jokes, they engage just enough, they make sure others see them as socially appropriate. But in private moments, when no external validation is present, the tone shifts. Replies become shorter. Eye contact becomes minimal. Energy becomes neutral at best, dismissive at worst. It's not always obvious hostility. Often, it's something more subtle, emotional withdrawal. And this is where most people get stuck, because the mind tries to reconcile the contradiction. You think, but they were just nice to me in front of others, so why do I feel this distance now? That cognitive dissonance creates confusion, and confusion weakens perception. When you're confused, you start over-explaining other people's behavior instead of observing it clearly. Psychologically, this pattern often comes from internal conflict. A person may not feel safe expressing their true feelings openly, so they split their behavior into two versions: the socially acceptable self and the privately restrained self. In public, they perform cooperation. In private, their true emotional stance leaks through, whether that stance is discomfort, resentment, indifference, or subtle dislike. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. Consistency is a form of honesty. Even when emotions are complex, consistent behavior creates clarity. Inconsistent behavior, however, creates distortion. It makes you question your own reading of reality. You begin adjusting your behavior to match their shifting tone, instead of staying anchored in your own sense of what is real. And over time, that has an effect on confidence, because human beings are wired to seek social coherence. When someone is warm in one context and cold in another, your nervous system starts scanning for what you did wrong, even when nothing has actually changed. You begin to modify yourself to regain consistency from them, instead of recognizing that the inconsistency is coming from their internal split, not your external behavior. There's also a quiet power dynamic embedded in this. Public warmth creates social safety. It signals to others we are fine. Private coldness removes emotional safety. It signals, but not fully. That gap keeps you slightly off balance. Not rejected outright, but not fully accepted either. And that in-between space is psychologically draining because it never allows closure. You are always trying to earn the private version of the relationship that never fully arrives. Now, here's the truth that often brings clarity. People who are genuinely aligned with you don't require different versions of themselves to interact with you. Their tone might vary depending on mood or context, but underlying respect remains stable. You don't have to decode their warmth. That's consistent enough to trust. But when someone's energy changes dramatically based on visibility, it tells you something important about where the relationship actually stands for them. It's not always hatred. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's emotional distance. Sometimes it's unresolved tension they don't know how to process directly. But whatever the cause, the effect on you is the same: instability in perception. And instability in perception leads to over-adjustment. You start performing for consistency instead of experiencing authenticity. You become more careful, more self-monitoring, more aware of how you are being received rather than how you are actually being treated. The turning point comes when you stop trying to synchronize with their shifting energy and instead observe it as data, not emotion, not assumption. Data. Because once you remove emotional interpretation from inconsistent behavior, it loses its ability to control your internal state. You stop asking, how do I fix this so they treat me the same everywhere, and start realizing their consistency is not my responsibility. And that realization is powerful because it returns you to your own center. You stop chasing emotional uniformity from people who are not offering it. You stop bending yourself to stabilize relationships that are unstable by design. And you begin to recognize that clarity is not something you extract from others, it's something you maintain within yourself. Because in the end, what unsettles people the most is not always hostility, it's inconsistency. And once you see it clearly, you stop getting lost inside it. And that changes everything. When someone consistently minimizes your achievements, it rarely looks like open hostility. It's much more refined than that. It doesn't come as you didn't do well. It comes as it's not that impressive, or anyone could have done that, or even worse, a quick change of subject that quietly erases the moment altogether. On the surface, it seems small, socially acceptable, easy to overlook. But psychologically, it carries weight, because recognition is not just about praise, it's about reality confirmation. When you achieve something meaningful, you are not only measuring progress, you are also looking for reflection. You are checking how the world responds to your growth so your mind can integrate it as real. When that reflection is consistently diminished, something subtle happens. Your internal calibration starts to shift. Instead of feeling grounded in your progress, you begin questioning it. Instead of feeling expansion, you feel hesitation. And instead of owning your achievements fully, you start shrinking them before others can shrink them for you. That's the quiet effect of repeated minimization. It doesn't just reduce your success in conversation, it reduces it in your perception. Now, the important distinction here is this: not everyone who downplays something is doing it out of hidden resentment. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's personality. Some people are simply uncomfortable with celebration or exaggeration. But when there is a pattern, especially from the same individuals, especially when it consistently happens around your growth but not around others who are no longer looking at neutral behavior, you are looking at selective reduction. And selective reduction is psychologically significant because it reveals comparison beneath the surface. It suggests that your progress is not being received neutrally, it is being measured against something internal in them. Sometimes that is insecurity. Sometimes it is unresolved competition. Sometimes it is emotional distance disguised as objectivity. But whatever the root, the outcome is the same. Your experience is being subtly flattened. There's a deeper philosophical layer to this as well. Human beings don't just want to succeed, they want their success to be witnessed in a way that affirms meaning. Meaning is not created in isolation, it is reinforced through acknowledgement. That doesn't mean external validation defines your worth, it means humans are relational beings. We process reality through reflection. So when that reflection is distorted or minimized, it creates cognitive friction. You start to feel like you are overestimating yourself for simply acknowledging your own progress. You begin to hesitate before sharing good news. You might even downplay your own wins preemptively, just to avoid discomfort in others. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin participating in your own minimization. That is where this becomes more than just social behavior. It becomes internal conditioning, because the mind adapts to emotional environments. If your environment consistently responds to your growth with neutrality or reduction, your nervous system learns that expansion is socially risky. So you start making yourself smaller, not because anyone explicitly told you to, but because the emotional feedback loop trained you to. But here's what most people eventually realize when they step back. Genuine supporters don't need to exaggerate your success, but they also don't need to reduce it. They can hold space for it without discomfort. They can acknowledge it without comparison. There is a sense of ease in how they respond, even if the words are simple. The absence of ease is what you notice when minimization is happening. There is a subtle tightening in the conversation, a quick pivot away, a softened acknowledgement that feels more like closure than engagement. It doesn't celebrate your moment, it closes it. And when something consistently closes your moments instead of expanding them, it begins to affect how you enter new ones. You become more cautious about sharing, more selective about joy, more internalized in your wins. Not because you are growing stronger, but because you are adapting to emotional resistance. The real shift happens when you recognize that not all environments are designed to expand you. Some are neutral, some are limited by the person's own internal framework, and some are simply not aligned with your growth trajectory. That doesn't make them enemies, it makes them inaccurate mirrors. And once you understand that, you stop seeking full reflection from partial sources. You start owning your achievements internally first, without waiting for permission to feel them fully. You stop shrinking your language to make others comfortable. You stop translating your growth into smaller terms just to maintain social ease. Because real progress doesn't require exaggeration, but it also doesn't survive minimization. It requires clear acknowledgement, first from yourself, and then from those who are capable of seeing it without distortion. And when you finally stop negotiating your success down to fit someone else's comfort level, something powerful happens. Your life stops asking for approval and starts standing in truth. And in that moment, your growth no longer needs to be validated, it simply needs to be lived. There's a very specific kind of emotional response that reveals more than words ever could, and it shows up most clearly when something good happens to you. A promotion, a breakthrough, a personal win, something you've worked for, something that actually matters to you. You share it, not because you need validation, but because that's what humans do. We share moments of expansion with the people around us. And then you watch the response, not just the words, but the energy behind them. Because sincerity has a certain quality to it. It's not exaggerated, but it's present. It feels engaged. It carries warmth. Even simple words like "that's great" can feel meaningful when they're emotionally alive. But when that emotional presence is missing, when the response feels flat, delayed, or mechanically polite, your nervous system notices it before your mind fully processes it. A congratulation without warmth is still a sentence, but it's not an experience. And human beings don't just register language, we register emotional tone. That tone is where authenticity lives. Now, most people try to rationalize this away. They say maybe they're just tired, or maybe they're not expressive, or maybe I'm reading too much into it. And sometimes that's true. Not everyone expresses excitement in the same way. But psychology is not about isolated moments, it's about patterns over time. When someone consistently responds to your wins with neutrality, they are showing you that they value your success and are willing to work together to achieve a common goal. Detachment or emotional distance, especially compared to how they respond to others, you are no longer dealing with expression style. You are dealing with emotional incongruence. An emotional incongruence creates a very specific internal effect. It makes your success feel slightly unreal in social space. Because recognition doesn't just confirm achievement, it amplifies it. When someone you trust engages with your success, it strengthens the emotional imprint of that moment. It tells your brain, this matters. This is real. This is worth integrating into your identity. But when that engagement is absent, the moment doesn't fully land. It exists, but it doesn't expand. You start noticing subtle shifts in yourself. You might share less. You might downplay good news before you even say it. You might shorten your own excitement to match the emotional ceiling of the person you're speaking to. Not because they told you to, but because their lack of response taught you where the boundary of enthusiasm is allowed to be. And that's where this becomes psychologically significant. Because over time, repeated flat responses don't just affect communication, they affect emotional expression. You begin to regulate your own excitement based on anticipated reactions. That means your external environment starts shaping your internal emotional range. And that is a quiet form of conditioning most people never notice until much later. There's also a deeper interpersonal dynamic at play. When someone consistently responds to your success without warmth, it often reflects their own internal relationship with progress, comparison, or self-worth. It doesn't always mean hostility. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's emotional fatigue. Sometimes it's a learned pattern of restraint. But whatever the cause, the effect on you is the same. Your expansion is not being emotionally mirrored. And without mirroring, human experience feels incomplete. Because we are wired for shared emotional resonance. That's why celebration feels more powerful in a group than alone. That's why acknowledgement deepens meaning. We don't just want to succeed, we want our success to be seen in a way that matches its emotional weight. When that doesn't happen consistently, something subtle begins to form. You stop expecting emotional participation from certain people. And once you stop expecting it, you also stop offering full expression around them. You unconsciously reduce your emotional output to match their ceiling. That's not maturity. That's adaptation. And adaptation is not always growth. Now, here's the turning point. Not everyone is capable of meeting your emotional reality. Some people simply don't have the bandwidth, awareness, or openness to engage with others' success in a deeply present way. And understanding that is not about judgment, it's about clarity. Because clarity removes confusion, and confusion is what drains energy. When you stop interpreting emotional flatness as something you need to fix, explain, or earn a response from, you reclaim your internal space. You stop outsourcing the emotional validation of your life to people who are not emotionally participating in it. And instead, you begin to anchor your experience in your own recognition first. That doesn't mean you stop sharing your wins. It means you stop shrinking them based on who you're sharing them with. Because real support doesn't always need big words, but it does require presence. And where presence is missing, perception becomes distorted. So the question is not just who congratulates you, but who actually meets your moments with emotional reality. And once you can see the difference, you stop confusing politeness for participation and silence for neutrality. You start choosing your emotional environment more consciously, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for your own growth. Because your progress deserves more than acknowledgement, it deserves resonance. And once you understand that, you stop lowering your light to fit dim reflections and you start standing where your success is allowed to fully exist. Memory is powerful, but selective memory is even more powerful. And in social dynamics, it can quietly shape how you are seen long after you've changed. Have you ever noticed how some people can clearly recall your mistakes, your awkward moments, your lowest points? But when it comes to your growth, your effort, your evolution, they suddenly become vague. They remember who you were, but not who you are becoming. And over time, that imbalance starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. This is what it means when someone consistently remembers your mistakes but forgets your growth. On the surface, it may look like casual recall. Oh yeah, I remember when you messed that up. You used to be like this. You were always bad at that. But notice what's missing in those statements. There is no proportional memory of change. The mind is holding on to one version of you while ignoring the evidence that you have moved beyond it. Psychologically, this is called narrative fixation. People form an internal story about who you are, and once that story stabilizes, everything you do gets filtered through it. Instead of updating the story, they interpret new behavior in a way that preserves the old version. So even when you grow, the lens doesn't. Change, it bends your growth to fit the past. And this has a subtle but very real impact on identity. Because identity is not just self-created, it is also socially reinforced. The way people respond to you contributes to how stable your sense of self feels in shared environments. When others consistently reflect your past mistakes but not your progress, they are not your progress. It creates a kind of temporal imbalance. You are living in the present but being socially referenced in the past. Over time, this can make you feel like you are always catching up to how you are perceived. You might find yourself over-explaining your growth, proving your change, or trying to convince people that you are no longer who you used to be. But the deeper truth is this: people who are committed to an old narrative rarely update it through explanation. They update it through disruption, or not at all. And that's where emotional fatigue begins to form. Because constantly being measured against an outdated version of yourself is exhausting. It forces you into a cycle of justification instead of presence. Instead of simply living your growth, you find yourself defending it. Instead of being seen for your evolution, you are repeatedly asked to reconcile with your history. But here's what's important to understand. This is not always intentional cruelty. In many cases, it's cognitive economy. The human brain prefers stable narratives because they require less mental effort than constantly updating perception. Once someone categorizes you in a certain way, careless, quiet, inconsistent, emotional, whatever it may be, that category becomes a shortcut. It simplifies social processing. The problem is, shortcuts reduce accuracy. And when people stop updating their perception of you, they are no longer interacting with you, they are interacting with a memory of you. That's why growth can feel strangely invisible in certain environments. Not because it didn't happen, but because it hasn't been integrated into their internal model of who you are. And when that happens, you are left in a strange position. You are evolving in reality, but being interpreted through a frozen lens. The danger here is not just external misunderstanding, it's internal pressure. Because when your growth is not reflected back to you socially, you may start questioning its validity. You might think, if they still see me this way, maybe I haven't changed enough. and that is where perception starts to leak into self-perception. But clarity changes everything. Because once you recognize that some people are operating from outdated versions of you, you stop treating their perception as a real-time assessment. You start seeing it as historical data, not irrelevant but not current either. And that distinction matters. It allows you to stop arguing with old narratives and start living new ones. You stop over-investing energy into convincing people who are not updating their internal file on you. You stop rehearsing your growth for audiences that are replaying your past, and instead, you direct that energy into consistency because consistency is what eventually overrides narrative lag. And here's the deeper philosophical truth: people are not obligated to update their perception of you at the same speed that you evolve. But you are also not obligated to remain emotionally attached to their outdated version. That's the boundary. Because growth is not just about becoming better, it's about refusing to be reduced. And when you finally stop negotiating with versions of yourself that no longer exist in reality, something shifts. You stop seeking permission to be who you already are. You stop waiting for recognition that may never come from certain places. And you begin to anchor your identity in lived truth, not outdated reflection. Because at the end of the day, you are not your past in someone else's memory, you are your present in motion. And once you fully understand that, you stop asking to be seen differently, and you start living in a way that makes old narratives irrelevant. There's a pattern in human behavior that becomes very visible once you start paying attention to consistency over time. And it shows up most clearly in how people treat you when your circumstances change. You may notice that some people's respect doesn't feel stable. It doesn't feel anchored in who you are, but in what you have, what you can offer, or what role you currently play in their life. When things are going well for you, they are slightly distant. When you are struggling, they become more present, more engaged, sometimes even more comfortable. And at first glance, this can feel confusing, even contradictory. Why would someone be more available when you are lower and less present when you are higher? This is where the idea of conditional respect becomes important. Because real respect is not highly sensitive to fluctuations in status. It doesn't disappear when you succeed, and it doesn't intensify when you struggle. It remains relatively steady because it is rooted in the person, not the position. But conditional respect is different. It responds to hierarchy, utility, and emotional equilibrium. It shifts depending on where you stand in the dynamic at any given moment. Psychologically, this often reflects comparison-based perception. Some people are more comfortable relating to others when they feel slightly above them, or at least not beneath them. So when you begin to rise, whether in confidence, success, clarity, or independence, it can create internal discomfort. Not always conscious, not always malicious, but real nonetheless. Your growth changes the relational balance they are accustomed to. And when that balance shifts, their behavior adjusts to restore internal comfort. Sometimes that adjustment looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like reduced enthusiasm. Sometimes it looks like subtle withdrawal. Not necessarily hostility, but a cooling of energy that you can feel, even if you can't easily prove it in words. On the other side, when you are going through difficulty, the dynamic often shifts again. You become more relatable, more emotionally accessible, less threatening to their internal comparison framework, and so engagement increases. But here is the critical insight. When presence is tied to your decline and distance is tied to your rise, the connection is not stable, it is situational. And situational connection is not the same as grounded respect. This pattern can create a subtle emotional confusion if you are not aware of it. Because as human beings, we naturally interpret attention as care and distance as rejection. So when someone becomes more available during your low points, it can feel like support. And when they withdraw during your high points, it can feel like disapproval. But beneath that emotional interpretation, there is often a much simpler structure. They are responding not to you as a person, but to where you sit in their internal comparison system. This is why awareness is essential. Without awareness, you start misreading the emotional logic of the relationship. You may begin to believe that your success is causing disconnection, or that your struggle is what earns closeness. And if that belief takes root, it can subtly shape your behavior. You might hesitate to fully step into your growth or unconsciously maintain struggle patterns just to preserve relational stability. That is how conditional dynamics quietly influence identity. But once you see it clearly, the pattern loses its control over you. You begin to recognize that consistency is the real signal, not intensity. Anyone can be present when it is easy to be present. Anyone can step in when you are vulnerable. The deeper question is, does their presence remain stable when your life expands beyond the frame they are comfortable with? And if it doesn't, that doesn't automatically make them harmful. It's simply me.